Hello, listeners. We have gotten a lot of questions about diagnosis, difficulty with diagnosis, and misdiagnosis. And this is a huge topic. The reality is that neurodivergence looks different for everyone and shares a lot of symptoms and features with other experiences and conditions. Many people also have co occurring conditions, meaning they have more than one diagnosis. Then, layered on top of this, we have stereotypes, biases, barriers to access, a shortage of providers, etc.
My
Yeah,
gosh.
it's a lot.
Yeah, right?
Um, all of these things and more add up to the reality that many people experience difficulty in obtaining a diagnosis, and sometimes people receive a misdiagnosis.
Oh, yes. Sometimes that happens.
Uh-huh.
So, today we're going to talk about some of the reasons for this, why it matters, and what we can do about it. This is kind of an overview episode, and then we'll do a little bit of deeper dives throughout the season. Welcome to Parenting Neurodivergent Humans. I'm Dr. Morgan Beidelman. I am a clinical psychologist, former school psych, former teacher, neurodivergent myself, and parent to two humans, one of whom is neurodivergent.
And I'm Breann Colpitz. I'm a school psychologist turned social coach for twice exceptional kids. I'm a mom to a couple neurodivergent kids and a late realized ADHD human, which means I'm double blessed with autism and ADHD. Thanks for being here. We're so glad you're here. Okay. So there's lots of reasons why diagnosis can be difficult or a misdiagnosis can occur. So let's get into some of that. As Morgan said, this is an overview. We know that historically certain groups of people have had more difficulty with this for various reasons. So again, this episode is just general overview. All right. So as you know, we're funded by the Big Bucket Lobby. So today we're going to talk about buckets, categories, okay? So, the first big bucket is the reality that someone's experience can make getting a correct diagnosis difficult. To be clear, these realities don't mean that someone can't get a correct diagnosis or that they don't deserve one, all right? The reality is that these factors can and do lead to missed or misdiagnosis.
Yes. So, said another way, what can happen for people is that there are layers of their experience. And sometimes in an evaluation process, if we don't explore all the layers in something that's called differential diagnosis, we might miss something or glom onto something else, which then, of course, leads us to miss it. So, what we want to do in good evaluation, not that this is an evaluation episode, but in good evaluation, we want to get as much information up front across all these different categories of things that could be impacting somebody, and then rule certain things in and out to figure out what is really going on for somebody, or the couple of things that might really be going on for somebody. That does not always happen. And so some of the things that can get in the way or can impact a diagnosis can kind of fall into several categories. So one of those buckets includes things like making sure that we understand other medical diagnoses and things that could be impacting from that perspective. Trauma, this is both the big things that we think of as trauma or big T traumas, but really it also includes something that is experienced as traumatic for an individual. And if you have some type of experience where you can distinctly remember how you were before and that you were different after, regardless of what that event is, that is a clue that something was experienced as traumatic to you. Is, man, I was this way before and poof, I'm this way after.
I also think that a lot of neurodivergent folks who are maybe unrealized undiagnosis are experiencing a lot of little t trauma. So, like you're saying, it doesn't have to be like this catastrophic situation, but it could be a lot of smaller things that impact who you are, who you feel like you are as a person over time that just kind of build up, which is complex post traumatic stress. So, like CPTSD, if you've heard of that. But yeah, for an evaluator or an assessor to have to tease all that out, it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yep, absolutely. Something that you can do to help is like if you know these categories, when you go to the evaluator, if you feel or the extent to which you feel comfortable, you can just tick down the list and pre-disclose some of that information. Again, if you feel comfortable, to try and make sure that there's as much body of information to be kind of gone through in the evaluation process. Another thing that can happen is co-occurrences of multiple neurodivergent diagnoses at the same time. Autism and ADHD is a good example.
Heyo. Yep.
Dyslexia and ADHD. Hello.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Then, of course, mental health, going through some of the things that might be going on for you from a mental health perspective. If you are on medications, and this can be medications that are not for mental health, this could be completely unrelated medical conditions. If you're on medication, you might want to disclose that as well, because some of the side effects of the medication can also look like either a mental health condition or a neurodivergent condition.
Right. So a lot of stuff to sort through. So especially as people get older, some people are very high masking, which can also make it difficult to get a full picture of what is going on for them. Maybe you have these coping skills or a lack thereof, but it's just been like, this is how my life is. And that's what it's been like for me. I've just always been coping and masking, and it's become my identity, but there's other stuff going on underneath for the reasons that I have been masking.
There's a husband and wife, they're on social media and they talk about like the husband is neurotypical and the wife is neurodivergent. And they often have these conversations that end up in this place where she's like, wait, not everybody is like this. And I so identify with that. I remember one of my best friends was saying something and I was like, not everybody just has this like constant stream of chatter running through their brains like at all times. He's like, no. My first thought was, that's boring. And then my second thought was, that might be nice.
Right. Yeah. Right. Because we don't know what we don't know about the lived experience of others and how our lived experience compares in the whole experience of life. We don't know that.
Yes. Getting us back on track here, we have that first bucket, which is about ourselves and kind of like ticking through what our own experiences or things that could be impacting us are. And then the second bucket is a little bit broader, like things that might be happening in our society that are then having an impact on us as well. These societal impacts can also impact the presentation of experiences. So, one of those is gender. Our ideas of what most types of neurodivergence looks like is based on the gender that was most studied. That is typically males. Up until very recently, almost all of the research done on autism was done on males. We also see that very commonly in ADHD. There's a lot of discussion around presentations of ADHD, and the typical, air quotes here, presentations of ADHD are what we more often see in boys. That then can lead to misdiagnosis because women are not showing up with the same diagnostic features that boys are. And since the studies were done around that, it's like, well, they can't be
Yeah.
autistic, can't have ADHD. It must be something else. When what has actually happened is that the group of people that were studied was only one gender.
Yeah. Too narrow.
Too narrow. That was a succinct way of saying it. Thank you.
Yeah. It's what I do. Well, not always. So, another area is race. And when you were talking about how we've studied boys, well, we studied white boys, let's be honest. A study from 2007 in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders looked at Medicaid eligible kids with an autism diagnosis to see if they had previously been diagnosed with something else. They found that African American kids were 3 times more likely than white kids to receive a misdiagnosis before their autism diagnosis. Further, African American kids were twice as likely as kids of other races to be diagnosed with a conduct disorder, while white kids were 5 times less likely than non white kids to be diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. This is a bit of a backtrack. Oh, just before that backtrack, Morgan raised her hand. What's up?
Just want to explain that an adjustment disorder falls
Ooh,
under
ooh.
mental health versus autism is very different type of disorder. So what is happening there is that people are seeing the symptoms, the behaviors, etc. And instead of taking a wider lens view and ticking through an autism checklist, instead they're seeing those symptoms and mapping them back to a mental health disorder, an adjustment disorder.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. All right. So, backtracking around this gender piece. About lost my dang mind. Reading this study, the sample was 79% male, and they never even mentioned that this is an issue. In fact, the word female doesn't appear in the article even one time. It just talks about the percent of the study that is male, and we are left to assume that the unmentioned 21% is female. So that's wild.
Part of the scientific process is that there is a section at the end of the study write up that should be called limitations. And one of the things that should happen is that you go through limitations. And when almost 80% of your sample is one gender, that should be outlined in the limitations. But the fact that they
Right.
never said female anywhere in the study suggests that it didn't even dawn on them or anybody else on their review team that this was a limitation.
Yeah, to not even see that your data is biased a certain way because you didn't even consider a whole group of people. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put a red flag on that one. Okay, more recent studies have shown that the racial gap in missed and misdiagnosis is changing, so that's good news. A 2024 study in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders actually found that autism diagnosis rates are now higher among African American kids than white kids. So, we're working on I mean, I'm not doing the research, but researchers are trying to work that out, right? They understand that there's this gap and they're trying to do some more studies to make it make sense. So these problems have long tails. The miss or underdiagnosed kids from the 80s and 90s, heyo, are often still living with those impacts. The impacts can be generational. These kids are often now themselves parents of neurodivergent kids. Hmm, I feel called out. But just the fact that undiagnosed or unrecognized neurodivergent parents are trying to figure these things out for their kids, but don't have the awareness that their kids are different because they're like them, but we're all neurodivergent.
Yeah, the number of times that I'm working with a family, the child gets a diagnosis, and when you go through the evaluation process, you do all of this assessment, and then there's something called a feedback session. And so the clinician sits down and talks through the process with the parents and the diagnosis or diagnoses that they came up with, if they came up with any, and then their rationale for it. And then, of course, like things you could do next to support your child. And time again, I'll have families sitting in those feedback sessions, and either they're like, that sounds like me, or they're like, that sounds like my other half. It's so common because in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot that was just missed. We didn't go through this.
Yeah, so our knowledge or lack thereof can make huge impacts on understanding and diagnosing for sure.
So staying with this bucket of societal things that can impact a diagnosis,
Mm.
there's just kind of two others that I want to make sure we hit on. One is what we think a diagnosis looks like. A lot of times we'll be like, oh gosh, like, well, they don't look autistic, or that isn't what ADHD really looks like, or feels like, or sounds like, or whatever. You can't be neurodivergent because you can do XYZ. And I think that's changing. I definitely feel like it's changing based upon what I see in my little small sliver of practice in the world, but it is still there for sure. And then the last is shame and fear. I think there's a lot that people don't disclose because they don't know that it is potentially something that other people are dealing with too. Or they think the opposite. They think everybody is dealing with it, but they're just doing a bad job of dealing with it. And so they don't want to disclose it. This is like not a neurodivergent situation, but I think it illustrates this. I don't have a sense of smell. I was born without one. And I remember being in pre-K, like someday I heard kids talking about smells. They had like scratch and sniff stickers. And then everyone's like talking about all these smells, and it was a whole thing. And I was like, oh no, I missed this day of pre-K. Everybody learned how to smell, and I didn't learn how to smell, and now I can't smell the stickers.
Aw.
Literally what I thought. So then I started memorizing when people would describe the different smells. I was like, "Ooh, I'll take note," so that I could describe it back because I didn't want anybody to know that I didn't learn how to smell. I think that that's like a very common experience for neurodivergent people because you're like, why does everybody else know how to do this but me? Like, why is everybody else better at this?
Yeah, aw, sending love to little Morgan. That's so sweet. And also, I feel like from the parent point of view, maybe you feel shame that, like, oh, yeah, my kid is this age old and they can't do X, Y, and Z, and you're feeling like a failure as a parent. So maybe you don't want to share it because you're like, well, this is just because I'm a failure, not because there's anything going on. Nothing to
Yeah.
see here.
If I were a better parent, this XYZ
Hmm.
wouldn't be happening.
Right. You're doing your best. We know you are. So the third bucket is around diagnostic tools, access, and expertise within the medical and mental health communities. So we don't have enough highly trained professionals to meet the need. Uneven access to the professionals that do exist is a real issue. Some communities are better served than others. Many are private pay only, and or you got to jump through the insurance hoops and all that kind of stuff, and it's just, not everyone has the resources to get a diagnosis, and or sometimes folks are like, "Well, I don't want my kid to have a label."
Yeah.
And so, you're sorting through those feelings and the fears associated with that. I'll also say that most teachers and school administration and pediatricians have little to no training in neurodivergence. Coming at it from my lived experience of being a school psychologist in the schools, first of all, that person only knows what they know. And then are they in the school all the time? Can they spot these things? Are they there long enough to see patterns, behaviors? Do they even have a green light to share their concerns? Because I'll tell you something, I'll tell you that for free, which is what Bandit on Bluey, the dad says, which I love. I was not allowed to share my concerns if I thought a kid had some sort of like other thing going on because my school district that I worked for was like, well, we can't say that because then we're liable to pay for it. I felt very censored as a school psychologist to be able to share certain thoughts, opinions, observations because of what it would mean for my employment.
As a former teacher, principal, and school psych as well, I will say from my experience, I had both. I'm 23 years in this career, and at the beginning, I definitely had that experience. I mean, I remember being told like, "Don't say this," and I was like, "But the kid has something when they were lived in this other state that said it, and
Yeah.
now they're in another state, and like suddenly
Hmm.
that diagnosis just disappears, and now there's a different one." I was like,
Yeah.
"That is so confusing." But now I feel like in the last 5, 7, maybe 10 years, I do feel like that's changing, at least in my personal experience in the school district that I worked in. And I also think it's really important that these providers, be it pediatricians, psychologists, etc., are given the opportunity to work in teams and have consultation. I am an experienced school psych, as are you, and especially experienced in some of these conditions that we see most commonly. And a couple of years ago, I wasn't even doing consultation, which is when you go and you're like, hey, can I present some information and get feedback and get ideas? It wasn't even a true consultation. It was me like shooting the shit with a colleague, and then we started talking through some of the diagnostic features of this evaluation that I was in the process of doing. And she goes, "Why aren't you considering autism?" And my mind was like, and it was because I had done an interview with a family. I had asked some questions, and I had glommed onto one part of this. And through this conversation with somebody else, she didn't get stuck in this set of information that I did. And so she saw a broader picture. And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah.
Right.
And I am so thankful for that. And so anytime that you can have people working together in safe spaces to bounce ideas off of each other, I think that you have better clinical practices, be it in a school or in a hospital setting or in a private setting.
Totally agree.
So easy to miss stuff,
Yep.
even when people are doing the best they can.
Yep.
That was a bird walk.
That's
Sorry.
okay. Well, let's talk about screeners. Speaking of missing things, let's talk about screeners.
Yeah.
Can you just define what a screener is? I think probably our listeners know, but they might not.
Yeah, thank you. So basically it's like a mini assessment that gives you information around like the probability or the likelihood that something could be going on for somebody. And so if something pops, usually on a screener, you'll get like low likelihood, somewhat likely, highly likely, right? And it kind of gives you this scale. And if somebody pops a certain way on a screener, that might be like a ding, ding, ding to then go do a more robust
Right.
abortion.
Yeah. So it's a way for folks to decide if further and deeper assessment is needed in a certain area.
Yes, you have a lot of places that do screeners more commonly than they have in the past. So a lot of doctors' offices, like peds offices, a lot of schools will do screeners. That can be very helpful to, again, kind of screen in or screen out certain behaviors that might then help you consider certain diagnoses as needed. However, I will say it is good, and only certain screeners are pretty routinely done. These are ones that are, again, for more common disabilities that we tend to see in our practices more regularly. And there can still be bias in the screener because the screener is based upon the current body of research. So I'll give you two examples. Years ago, I worked with somebody and I was flagging this person for autism, and they were being evaluated by somebody else because I was treating them, which means it was not best practice for me to evaluate them because I have too much bias, right? I
Yeah.
know them well. And they had wanted to figure out what was going on with them, right? So I did a referral to a couple of people that I think do really good practice. Ended up going with somebody. That person did a screener, and the screener didn't flag for for them to then do a bigger, more robust autism eval.
They didn't reach that cut point, that magic number that people say, "Oh yes, this warrants more information. This more warrants more evaluation." Let
Yes.
me guess, they made eye contact.
Yeah, this client was a woman, but what was great is the evaluator had gone back and had notes from when they had initially met, and it said, "My psychologist suggested that I see you. Here were some of the things that we together had outlined as areas that were particularly hard for me." So that evaluator called me and was like, "Hey, talk to me about what's going on here because this would flag more like this other condition." And I was like, "Here's why I don't think that's true." And then that evaluator was like, "I'm going to go ahead and do a full-blown autism assessment anyways, even though it didn't pop on the screener because there sounds like there's more going on here." And sure enough, it was.
Thanks to that evaluator for not having their ego wrapped up in it, not trying to think that they knew everything about this person, and being collegial and actually like reaching out on behalf of their client to really help them figure this stuff out. So, if you're that person and you're listening to this, thanks for being good at your job. Not everyone does that.
Yeah, and it was awesome because the way that his information was trending was towards OCD. And so we were able to have a conversation, and then he went and he did a full-blown evaluation. He goes, "Actually, I don't think that that's what this is." Right? There could be a co-occurrence for sure,
Right.
meaning that it's both, but that's not what ultimately he felt like was happening here. And why that's important is because the way that we therapeutically intervene and the medications that we consider if somebody is choosing to go a medical intervention route are more than likely different for those two diagnoses. And so that's why that's really pretty critically important. Flip
Yes.
side, I had somebody who had autism who was filling out an evaluation for anxiety as a screener to be able to talk to somebody about anxiety medication. And she came back completely average in all categories for anxiety. And I was like, "I would like to call that pediatrician and talk through," because what was happening for that person is they have pretty black or white thinking. And when
Mhm.
it says, "Do you always feel anxious getting ready to go to school?" She says, "No, because no, I don't always feel anxious,"
Yeah,
right?
last Friday was a one-off.
Yeah. Right, right. And so that's an indication where you might take a screener, and if they're using it as that sole evaluation tool to determine if you're going to get kicked up to see somebody for care or treatment, she came back looking dead average in every single category. Meanwhile, this person is biting their nails into their bleeding and pulling out their eyebrows and like engaging in all these behaviors where it's quite evident that they are highly anxious.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're describing it. They're saying,
Mm.
"I'm stressed and anxious." But if no one's talking to them and they're only filling out the screener as a precursor to having a conversation, and the screener comes back average, then no conversation is ever had.
Yep. Right. I think before we move on to like, what can we do to get the most accurate diagnosis? I think it's important to remember that most of these assessments that we're taking, including screeners, are written by neurotypical people and may not even make sense Two, or capture the lived experience of neurodivergent individuals or like your client interpreting these questions so literally because my brain lacks the ability to see the nuance here or to understand that always doesn't mean every single time, sometimes.
Right.
It's like, oh, oops.
I'm giving those stories as if it's like a particular client, but this is like happened over and over and over again. This is actually like a very common experience in my
Yeah.
practice, and in the practice of many other people who serve neurodivergent profiles.
Right. I think it's also common experience for autistic people to say the questions on some autism assessments lack the details or clarification that they feel like they can answer the question accurately.
Yeah.
So consider that an assessment piece. Did you think this was confusing? Okay, you're autistic. I'm being facetious here, but hopefully you get my point.
When I used to do assessment and the number of times that I'd be in a situation and they'd be like asking clarifying question after clarifying question after clarifying question on the directions, like, well, what does this mean? Well, do you mean this? Well, what if this happens? And I'm like, this is as much of the assessment as the thing that we're trying to
Yeah.
accomplish here.
Yeah, right. That's important information.
Whew, okay, so what can we do? Let's rein it in.
Yeah, we could go off a long time on this one, but let's give you some helpful tips.
Yes. So, first of all, looking for somebody who has relevant experience and asking questions about their experience. And then you can always look further or get another opinion. Like you could have a general practitioner that says that it's, not ADHD based on a screener that they've given, but you're feeling like ADHD really resonates with you. Like it's okay to pursue a second opinion, to get a full blown evaluation. If something doesn't feel right to you, go ahead and forge forward. Like, go ahead and see another person.
Yeah.
That's like a pretty common practice in the medical field to get a second opinion. It is okay to get a second opinion here, too.
Yep.
Third, I'm such a big, big, big advocate of this. If you think all the way back to this beginning of the episode where I was talking about things that you might want to tell an evaluator, like medical history and potential co-occurrences and mental health and trauma, et cetera, all those things, medications even that you're on, all of those can be discussed in something that's called a clinical interview. And psychologists and psychiatrists who are doing evaluations or like clinical evaluators in general, they should be doing a developmental interview with you. It is so critical to a robust, good evaluation. And so they should be asking you lots of questions, but it's also okay for you to kind of go through the categories that we shared above or other ones. And you make sure to also share for those, right? So that both parties are asking good questions and presenting good information. And I mean good as in like of value to the clinical process.
Yep. I love that. I know you're a stan of the clinical interview. It's so important to see like an individual's history over time to look for patterns and all that things. Be sure you're also sharing significant medical history, like surgeries, if your kiddo or depending on who's getting the evaluation here, spending time in the ICU, just sleep concerns, any type of that stuff, all important to mention. You want to be as open and honest as possible and encourage your child to do the same. Masking can make it more difficult to see what's going on. It can be helpful to think back to your younger self. If something used to be an issue, but now it isn't because you have accommodated yourself, it's important to let the evaluator know that. If you answer no, but, or no, because, it's probably actually a yes. That's you getting too technical in your answer.
Yeah, you're overthinking.
You're overthinking. Yep. Maybe because you want to be really honest, and so you're like, no, but whatever. So, yeah, consider that could be a yes. No, I don't have issues with socks because I found one brand that works for me. And those are the only ones I wear, is actually a yes. Textures do bother me. No, I'm not usually late. I used to be late, but now I have a whole system of alarms and prompts and reminders set up for myself that usually work. So that's actually a yes because you've accommodated yourself so much that without those things, it would default to you being late. Just consider how much you've accommodated yourself when you're giving these like yes or no answers. I'm not trying to get you like overanalyzing and overthinking, but just a helpful hint.
Absolutely. We've been talking a lot, and I want to make sure that we touch on misdiagnosis because
Yeah.
also happens. Maybe what I want to highlight here are some ways for you to think through if potentially what's happening here is misdiagnosis. And I think like a couple of ways that you can do this is like if the diagnosis just does not resonate with you. A lot of times people get diagnosed, they start reading things, right? They listen to podcast episodes, they listen to audiobooks, they read articles. And if you're reading, like, especially if you're reading more than one thing, right? Or listening to more than one thing, and you're like, this does not feel like my lived experience, that might be something that's kind of like a little flag going off as like, that might not actually fit me here. Another one that I think happens is when you're like collecting diagnoses.
Yeah, you
is
got all the letters. You got all
yeah,
the letters.
sometimes like I look at that and it's like 4 or 5 things, and a lot of times I'm like, this smells like trauma, like depending on what it is, right? Depending, but there is like a whole slew of diagnoses that a lot of people come through with. And when I see that little grouping of 3, 4, 5, I'm like, what has happened in this person's life? This smells like significant trauma that has ended up in a nice little bag of diagnoses here. Or conversely, you have a whole bunch of diagnoses and you're like, or it's just this one, like autism.
Yep. Yep.
So that could be something to consider as well. Not to say that co-occurrence does not happen, it absolutely does. And so, you could absolutely have two co-occurring disorders. That is 100% in the realm of possible. But again, if you feel like you're collecting them or they keep changing, right? Like
Mm,
you get an evaluation and first it's these three, and then you get another evaluation. It's like not those two, but now these two, right? Those can all be indicators that there might need to be a wider lens taken here. And that's where I would say, one, go back to your clinical interview and making sure that you are kind of like cataloging, categorizing as much information to bring back to an evaluator. And then also looking for evaluators that have expertise in multiples of these areas. So if somebody's saying autism, somebody else is saying OCD, I would look for an evaluator who has extensive experience in OCD and autism, so that when they are kind of going through and kind of looking at both things, they have enough deep knowledge about both disorders to be really ruling things in or ruling things out.
yeah. I think that's so important if you have a high masking human too. We've talked about what it means to be high masking. A kid falls apart every day after school because they're just holding it together all day. And this kiddo did not hit classic symptoms as a kid. They weren't dysregulated in the traditional ways. I'm using air quotes here that autistic people show up. And I'm speaking from autism because that's just what I know the most about in my lived experience here. But when you're interviewing people to do your assessment, like, do you commonly see high masking kids, or do you commonly evaluate kids who are twice exceptional? So that means kids who are gifted. So IQ is probably above average potentially. We could be gifted in other ways that aren't just academics or like IQ, but does your evaluator understand the nuanced presentations of these things like Morgan is talking about? Well within your rights to ask these questions when you're trying to find the right fit to get some more info if you choose to do an evaluation. Okay, let's wrap this up.
Are you still listening? We've been
Yeah.
talking a long time.
Anybody still out there? This one's going long. So I want to point you to a good resource. If you're looking for more information on the whole diagnosis process, Dr. Morgan has a whole course that will walk you through it step by step. It goes through the difference between doing an assessment through the school versus through an outside provider. It gives you a letter, checklist, the whole thing. So check the show notes for that if that would be helpful to you.
Thank you for listening. We're going to be back next week digging more into neurodivergence in girls and women. So please make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss it. And please, if you liked this episode, consider sharing it with a friend or somebody you think would also benefit from hearing it.
Sharing is caring, y'all. We appreciate that. If we are a good fit for you, join our communities. We'd love to have you. You can find us both on Instagram and YouTube under the same handles. Dr. Morgan is Dr. Morgan Beidelman, and Breann is It's Breann Colpitts. So come follow along over there. And yeah, love to see you there.
As always, if you have a question or a topic you want us to cover, send us a note. You can message us on Instagram or use the Google form in the show notes. So many of the topics that we are covering in season 2 are because of you. So if you have other things that you want us to discuss, please, please send us a note.
We love your notes. We love your questions. Shout out to our editor and producer, Erica Carpenter. This episode, as every other one, was edited and produced by Erica. Thank you.
We love you, Erica. Thanks for joining us, y'all. See you next week.
Bye. The longest episode in the world. Longest one.
There was a moment there where I was like, oh man, we're going to wrap this up like super well.
Mm, mm, mm.
And then, no, not so much.
After 10 more stories.
Just a quick disclosure, this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute a psychological client relationship and should not be used in place of expert evaluation or therapy.
Okay, let's do this. Let's do this. All right. Power pose. Power pose. Okay. Okay.